The industrial town of Riverside, Pennsylvania, had weathered decades of economic decline since the last textile mill closed its doors in 1987. What remained was a community of resilient families clinging to memories of better times, their lives intertwined with the rhythms of a place that had forgotten how to dream. In this landscape of faded brick buildings and overgrown lots, 10-year-old Becca Turner lived with her grandmother, Eleanor, in a 2-story house on Maple Street that had been in their family for 3 generations. Becca was the kind of child who found magic in ordinary moments. Every morning, she would stand before the hallway mirror and carefully tie bright yellow ribbons into her chestnut-brown hair, a ritual that began when her mother, Anne, had first placed those ribbons there on Becca's 5th birthday. Anne had been killed in a drunk driving accident just 2 months later, leaving behind a daughter whose smile could still light up rooms and a mother-in-law who had promised to love and protect her granddaughter with every breath in her body. Eleanor Turner was 68 years old and had worked as a seamstress at the Riverside Mills for 37 years before they closed. Her hands, marked by decades of precise work and the arthritis that came with age, still moved with practiced grace when she braided Becca's hair each morning. The yellow ribbons had become their shared language of love and remembrance, a way of keeping Anne's memory alive in their daily routine. Eleanor would watch from the kitchen window as Becca skipped down the sidewalk toward Jefferson Elementary, those ribbons catching the morning light like tiny beacons of hope in a town that had grown accustomed to disappointment. Before we dive deeper into this story, I'd love for you to take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. Your support helps us continue sharing these important stories that need to be told. And knowing where our viewers are from around the world always brightens our day. Now, let's continue with what happened on that autumn day that changed everything. October 23rd, 2010, dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of brilliant blue sky that made the turning leaves look like they were on fire. The old oak trees lining Maple Street had transformed into torches of red and gold, and there was that sharp bite in the air that promised winter wasn't far behind. Eleanor had awakened early, as she always did, and prepared Becca's favorite breakfast of scrambled eggs with cheese and toast cut into triangles the way her granddaughter preferred it. She watched from the doorway as Becca carefully selected 2 fresh ribbons from the small wooden box on her dresser, the same box that had belonged to Anne, filled with ribbons in every shade of yellow, from pale cream to bright sunflower gold. The morning routine unfolded with the comfortable predictability that had defined their lives for the past 5 years. Becca ate her breakfast while humming a song she had learned in music class, swinging her legs from the kitchen chair that was still a bit too tall for her. Eleanor packed her lunch in the same brown paper bag she used every day, including an extra cookie, because Saturday meant Becca would be staying after school for art club. Their conversation was filled with the easy chatter of 2 people who had learned to find joy in small things. Becca's excitement about the Halloween decorations her teacher was putting up in the classroom. Eleanor's plans to finish the quilt she was making for the church's Christmas bazaar. When it came time to leave for school, Eleanor walked with Becca to the corner of Maple and 3rd Street, just as she had every school day for the past 5 years. She watched her granddaughter join the small cluster of children waiting for the crossing guard, noting how Becca's ribbons fluttered in the morning breeze like yellow butterflies. "Be careful walking home," Eleanor called out, the same words she spoke every morning. "And remember what we talked about. Come straight home after art club. No detours, no stopping to play." Becca had waved and called back, "I promise, Grandma," her voice carrying on the autumn air with the confidence of a child who believed the world was fundamentally safe. But the world, as Eleanor Turner would learn in the most devastating way possible, was not always safe for little girls with yellow ribbons in their hair. When 3:30 came and went without the familiar sound of Becca's footsteps on the front porch, Eleanor felt the first flutter of unease in her chest. She told herself that art clubs sometimes ran late, that Mrs. Patterson, who supervised the program, was known for losing track of time when the children were particularly engaged in their projects. By 4 o'clock, however, that flutter had grown into something more urgent. Eleanor called the school and was told that art club had ended at exactly 3:15 and that all the children had been dismissed on schedule. When asked specifically about Rebecca Turner, the secretary checked with Mrs. Patterson and confirmed that Becca had left the building with the other children, her small hands covered in blue and green paint from the landscape she had been working on. The walk to Jefferson Elementary took Eleanor 20 minutes, her arthritic knees protesting with each hurried step. She retraced the route that Becca took every day, down 3rd Street to the traffic light, across Main Street, past Henderson's hardware store and the old movie theater that had been closed for 15 years, then up Franklin Avenue to where it dead-ended at the school. Along the way, she stopped every person she encountered, describing her granddaughter with the desperate precision of someone whose world was starting to tilt off its axis. 10 years old, about 4 feet tall, chestnut brown hair with yellow ribbons, wearing a blue jacket with a hood and carrying a purple backpack covered in butterfly stickers. Some people remembered seeing children walking home from school that afternoon, but in the casual way that adults notice children, as background music to their own concerns and conversations. Mrs. Henderson from the hardware store thought she might have seen a girl matching Becca's description walking past the store around 3:30, but she couldn't be certain. The crossing guard at Main and Franklin remembered helping several children cross the street, but Friday afternoon was always busy and individual faces tended to blur together in her memory. With each conversation, Eleanor felt the hope draining out of her like water from a broken vessel. By 5 o'clock, Eleanor was standing in the parking lot of Jefferson Elementary, staring at the empty playground, where children's laughter still seemed to echo in the cooling air. She called 911 from the payphone outside the school's main office, her voice shaking as she explained to the dispatcher that her 10-year-old granddaughter was missing, that she had never been late coming home before, that something was terribly wrong. The dispatcher's questions came in a steady, professional rhythm. When had Eleanor last seen her granddaughter? What was she wearing? Did she have any friends she might have gone to visit? Any relatives who might have picked her up from school? Each question felt like a stone thrown into the growing darkness of Eleanor's fear. Detective James Crawford arrived at Eleanor's house on Maple Street at 6:30 that evening, just as the first streetlights were beginning to flicker on against the gathering dusk. He was a compact man in his mid-40s with graying temples and the kind of steady, reassuring presence that came from 20 years of police work in small towns, where everyone knew everyone else's business. He sat at Eleanor's kitchen table, the same table where Becca had eaten breakfast that morning, and filled out the missing person report with the methodical care of someone who understood that details could mean the difference between finding a child and losing her forever. The formal search began within 2 hours of Detective Crawford's arrival. Riverside was small enough that news traveled with the speed of wildfire, and by 8:30 that evening, more than 50 volunteers had gathered in the parking lot of Jefferson Elementary. They came carrying flashlights and hope, wearing the grim expressions of adults who knew that every hour that passed made the odds worse but weren't willing to admit it out loud. The volunteers included teachers from the elementary school, members of Eleanor's church, neighbors who had watched Becca grow from a grief-stricken 5-year-old into the laughing, resilient child she had become, and parents who understood that this could happen to any of them. Detective Crawford organized the volunteers into search teams of 4 or 5 people each, assigning them specific quadrants of the town to cover. The searches would be systematic and thorough. Every alley, Every abandoned building, every patch of woods or overgrown lot where a 10-year-old girl might hide or be hidden. The teams were equipped with whistles to signal if they found anything, two-way radios to maintain contact with the command post that had been set up in the school gymnasium, and photographs of Becca that Eleanor had provided. School pictures that showed her bright smile, and those yellow ribbons that had become her trademark. The old Riverside mill complex was searched that first night, of course. The massive brick buildings had stood empty for 23 years, their broken windows and graffiti-covered walls serving as monuments to the town's industrial past. The complex sprawled across 12 acres on the banks of the Allegheny River, a maze of interconnected buildings that had once housed spinning frames and looms, offices and storage areas, cafeterias and maintenance shops. Urban explorers occasionally broke through the chain-link fencing to photograph the ruins or to spray paint their names on walls that had once echoed with the sounds of productive work. Detective Crawford led one of the search teams through the mill complex personally, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness to illuminate piles of debris, rusted machinery, and the occasional evidence of homeless camps or teenage drinking parties. They called Becca's name until their voices were hoarse, the sound echoing through empty hallways and up staircases that led to nowhere. They found nothing, no sign that a 10-year-old girl had ever set foot in those cavernous spaces where pigeons roosted in the rafters and weeds grew through cracks in the concrete floors. The river itself was searched beginning at dawn on Saturday morning. The Allegheny ran high and fast that time of year, swollen with autumn rains and carrying debris from upstream communities. Divers from the county sheriff's department methodically worked their way along both banks, their underwater searches complemented by boats that dragged the deeper channels with hooks and nets. The water was cold enough that hypothermia would have been a factor within minutes. But they searched anyway, because leaving any possibility unexplored was unthinkable when a child's life hung in the balance. Search dogs arrived from Pittsburgh on Saturday afternoon, German shepherds trained in tracking and cadaver detection, their handlers experienced in the heartbreaking work of finding missing children. The dogs were given articles of Becca's clothing to establish her scent, then worked in methodical patterns through the town, their sensitive noses capable of detecting traces of human presence that had been left hours or even days earlier. They showed interest in several locations: the playground at Riverside Park, where Becca played on weekends, the sidewalk in front of Anderson's ice cream shop, where she sometimes stopped for treats, the path along the river, where she occasionally walked with Eleanor on summer evenings. But none of the dog's alerts led to Becca herself. They found old scent trails that spoke to the ordinary movements of a child through the landscape of her daily life, but nothing that indicated where she had gone on that Friday afternoon when she had walked out of Jefferson Elementary and into a mystery that would haunt Riverside for years to come. As Saturday stretched into Sunday and Sunday into Monday, the search expanded beyond Riverside's borders. State police coordinated with law enforcement agencies in neighboring counties, distributing Becca's photograph and description to departments across western Pennsylvania. Her picture appeared on local television news broadcasts and in newspapers throughout the region, always accompanied by the same heartbreaking details: 10 years old, 4 feet tall, chestnut brown hair with yellow ribbons, last seen leaving Jefferson Elementary School on Friday afternoon. The FBI's Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team arrived from Philadelphia on Tuesday morning, bringing with them resources and expertise that the Riverside Police Department simply didn't possess. Special Agent Patricia Williams, a 20-year veteran of crimes against children, established a command center in the conference room at City Hall and began the process of re-interviewing everyone who had been questioned during the first days of the search. Her questions were more detailed and pointed than Detective Crawford's had been, designed to uncover memories and observations that might have seemed unimportant to local investigators, but could provide crucial clues to someone trained in the patterns of child predators. Eleanor Turner aged 10 years in the first week after Becca's disappearance. She stopped eating regular meals, surviving instead on coffee and the casseroles that neighbors brought in an endless stream of well-intentioned kindness. She refused to leave the house, except to participate in search efforts, afraid that she might miss a phone call or that Becca might somehow find her way home to discover an empty house. Sleep became impossible, replaced by a restless vigilance that kept her moving through the rooms of her home like a ghost, touching Becca's belongings and whispering prayers to a God who seemed to have stopped listening. The yellow ribbons that neighbors tied to trees and fence posts throughout Riverside served as constant reminders of what had been lost. They fluttered in the autumn wind like captured pieces of sunlight, visible from blocks away and impossible to ignore. Local businesses displayed Becca's picture in their windows, and the elementary school organized a prayer vigil that filled the gymnasium with candles and hope and the sound of children's voices singing hymns that spoke of protection and safe journeys home. But as October turned to November and November stretched toward December, the harsh mathematics of missing children cases began to assert themselves. The active search teams grew smaller as volunteers returned to their own lives and responsibilities. The FBI agents packed up their equipment and returned to Philadelphia, leaving behind detailed files and the promise that the case would remain open and active. Detective Crawford continued to follow up on every lead and tip that came in, but the calls grew less frequent with each passing day, and most of them led nowhere productive. The last confirmed sighting of Becca Turner came from Tommy Martinez, a 16-year-old high school student who'd been walking home from football practice on the afternoon she disappeared. Tommy lived on Franklin Avenue, just 3 blocks from Jefferson Elementary, and his route home took him along the same streets that Becca would have traveled. He remembered seeing a girl who matched her description standing near the bus stop at Franklin and River Street, about halfway between the school and Eleanor's house on Maple Street. What made the sighting particularly memorable was that the girl had seemed to be looking around uncertainly, as if she wasn't sure which direction to go. Tommy's description placed Becca at Franklin and River Street at approximately 3:25 p.m. on Friday afternoon, 10 minutes after art club ended and 15 minutes before Eleanor began to worry about her granddaughter's absence. From that intersection, Becca would normally have continued straight on Franklin for 2 more blocks, then turned left on Maple Street for the final 3-block walk to her grandmother's house. It was a route she had traveled hundreds of times, as familiar to her as the rooms in her own home. The fact that she had seemed confused or uncertain suggested that something had already begun to go wrong by the time Tommy saw her. But Tommy's account, detailed as it was, left more questions than answers. If Becca had been at Franklin and River Street at 3:25, where had she gone from there? Had someone approached her and convinced her to deviate from her normal route home? Had she seen something or someone that had made her afraid to continue walking alone? Detective Crawford interviewed every resident and business owner along Franklin Avenue, looking for other witnesses who might have seen Becca after 3:25, but he found no one else who could place her anywhere at any time after Tommy's sighting. The investigation expanded to include registered sex offenders within a 50-mile radius of Riverside, a depressingly long list of men who had been convicted of crimes against children and were now living under the supposed supervision of various parole and probation departments. Each name was investigated thoroughly, alibis verified, current addresses confirmed, associates interviewed. Several of the men had been in violation of their registration requirements or had failed to report changes in their employment or living situations, leading to arrests and prosecutions that brought a measure of justice for other crimes but did nothing to bring Becca home. Winter arrived early that year, with the first significant snowfall coming in late November and temperatures dropping well below freezing for days at a time. The search efforts necessarily became more limited and focused, concentrated on buildings and structures where a child might seek shelter from the cold. Abandoned houses were searched again, along with garages, sheds, and any other enclosed spaces that might provide warmth and concealment. Volunteers checked heating grates and storm drains, anywhere a frightened child might crawl to escape the brutal Pennsylvania winter. Eleanor Turner's hope began to transform during those winter months, evolving from the desperate belief that Becca would walk through the front door at any moment to a more sustained but quieter faith that somehow, somewhere, her granddaughter was still alive. She started attending the support group meetings that had been organized for families of missing children, finding comfort in the company of other people who understood the particular kind of anguish that came with not knowing. She learned to speak about Becca in the present tense, refusing to use past tense verbs that might suggest acceptance of an outcome too terrible to contemplate. Christmas came and went, with a subdued observance that acknowledged the season while honoring the emptiness at the center of Eleanor's world. The tree she put up in the living room was smaller than in previous years, decorated with ornaments that Becca had made in school art classes, construction paper angels and popsicle stick stars and cotton ball snowmen that smiled with crayon faces. Eleanor placed Becca's presents under the tree anyway, new books and art supplies, and a dollhouse she had been secretly building in the basement workshop, wrapped in bright paper and marked with gift tags that read, "For Becca, with love from Grandma." The first anniversary of Becca's disappearance was marked with a memorial service at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, where Eleanor had worshipped for 40 years and where Becca had sung in the children's choir every Sunday since she was 6 years old. The sanctuary was filled with yellow ribbons and sunflowers, Becca's favorite flower, and with people whose lives had been touched by a little girl who had found ways to spread joy even in a town that had been slowly dying for decades. Eleanor spoke at the service, her voice steady despite the tears that ran down her cheeks, sharing memories of her granddaughter's laughter and kindness, and the way she had insisted on helping elderly Mrs. Patterson next door carry her groceries every Saturday morning. Detective Crawford officially retired in 2015, but he never stopped working on Becca's case. He maintained his own files in a spare bedroom of his house, copies of every report and photograph and interview transcript that had been generated during the investigation. Twice a month, he would drive through Riverside, checking on abandoned buildings and talking to residents who might have new information or might have remembered something they had forgotten to mention years earlier. His replacement, Detective Angela Santos, was a dedicated investigator who brought fresh eyes to the case, but she found the same frustrating absence of concrete leads that had stymied Crawford for 5 years. Eleanor Turner died of a heart attack in January 2018, 8 years after Becca's disappearance. She was found at her kitchen table, surrounded by photographs of her granddaughter and holding in her hands a yellow ribbon that had belonged to Becca. The funeral filled St. Matthew's Church once again, but this time the service was for a woman who had spent the last 8 years of her life keeping hope alive through sheer force of will, who had never stopped believing that love could bridge any distance and that the truth would eventually come to light. The house on Maple Street was sold to a young couple from Pittsburgh who were attracted by the reasonable price and the established neighborhood of mature trees and friendly neighbors. They were unaware of the house's history when they signed the purchase agreement, learning only later about the little girl who had once lived there and the grandmother who had never stopped waiting for her to come home. The new owners kept some of Eleanor's furniture, including the kitchen table where she had died, but they cleared out the bedroom that had remained exactly as Becca had left it, donating the clothes and toys to charity and painting over the growth chart marks that Eleanor had been so careful to maintain on the inside of the closet door. Years passed. Riverside continued its slow decline, losing more businesses and residents as younger generations moved away in search of opportunities that their hometown could no longer provide. The old mill complex fell into even deeper decay, its buildings becoming increasingly dangerous as roofs collapsed and floors rotted through. The city council voted several times to demolish the structures, but the cost of environmental cleanup and asbestos abatement made the project prohibitively expensive for a municipality that was already struggling to maintain basic services. Urban exploration became increasingly popular during the late 2010s, driven by social media platforms that rewarded dramatic photography of abandoned places. The Riverside Mill complex attracted photographers from across Pennsylvania and neighboring states, people who were drawn to the aesthetic of industrial decay and who were willing to risk trespassing charges to capture images of rusted machinery and broken windows framed against sky that showed through collapsed roofs. Most of these visitors were respectful of the property and interested only in photography, but their presence meant that the mill complex was no longer the completely forgotten place it had been for most of the years since Becca's disappearance. On March 15, 2024, a photography group from Carnegie Mellon University made the discovery that would finally begin to answer the questions that had haunted Riverside for nearly 14 years. The group consisted of 5 students who were working on a documentary project about post-industrial landscapes in western Pennsylvania. They had received permission from the city to photograph inside the mill complex, part of a broader academic study of how communities adapt to economic transition and physical decay. Lisa Chen, a graduate student in the Fine Arts program, was photographing in the basement of Building C, the former weaving facility that had been the heart of the mill's operations during its productive years. The basement had been used for storage and mechanical equipment, and it retained more of its original structure than the upper floors, which had suffered more damage from weather and vandalism. Lisa was particularly interested in the contrast between the geometric precision of the mill's original construction and the organic patterns of decay that had developed over decades of abandonment. She was adjusting her camera settings to capture the interplay of light and shadow near a collapsed section of exterior wall when something caught her eye, a flash of color that seemed out of place among the rust and concrete and accumulated debris of decades. Moving closer and using her camera's telephoto lens to examine the area more carefully, Lisa realized she was looking at fabric, something that had been caught in the twisted remains of what had once been a floor drain system. The fabric was yellow, faded, but unmistakably deliberate in its placement, as if it had been carefully positioned rather than randomly discarded. Lisa called to her teammates, and together they carefully extracted what they quickly realized was a child's hair ribbon, yellow silk, that had somehow retained its color, despite being exposed to moisture and decay for what appeared to be many years. The ribbon was photographed extensively before being carefully placed in a plastic bag, and the group immediately contacted both the university's administration and the Riverside Police Department to report what they had found. Detective Santos arrived at the mill complex within an hour of Lisa's call, accompanied by a team of crime scene technicians and a forensic photographer who documented the ribbon's location and condition with exhaustive thoroughness. The ribbon was transported to the State Police Forensics Laboratory in Harrisburg for analysis, though Santos already suspected what the DNA testing would confirm. After 13.5 years, Becca Turner was speaking to them again. The discovery of the ribbon triggered the most intensive investigation that Riverside had seen since the original search in 2010. The entire mill complex was declared a crime scene, and teams of investigators began a systematic examination of every building and every room, looking for additional evidence that might have been missed during previous searches, or that might have been concealed by someone who had access to the property. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in to scan for anomalies beneath the concrete floors, and cadaver dogs were deployed throughout the complex with handlers who specialized in detecting human remains that had been concealed for extended periods. The basement of Building C became the focus of particularly intense scrutiny. The room where Lisa Chen had found the ribbon was photographed from every possible angle, and investigators used specialized lighting and magnification equipment to examine every surface for traces of evidence that might have been invisible to the naked eye. They found scratches in the concrete walls that appeared to have been made by fingernails or small pieces of metal, scratches that formed letters when viewed from the correct angle and distance. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a forensic anthropologist from the University of Pittsburgh, was called in to analyze the scratches and determine whether they might represent an attempt at communication by someone who had been confined in the basement. Her examination, conducted with high-powered magnification and specialized photographic techniques, revealed a pattern that made everyone involved in the investigation feel sick to their stomachs. Scratched into the concrete wall, at a height consistent with a 10-year-old child, were the letters B-E-C-C-A, followed by H-E-L-P. The scratches appeared to have been made with a small piece of metal, possibly a nail or a fragment of wire, and they showed the characteristics of having been carved by someone with limited strength working over an extended period of time. Most significantly, the concrete around the scratches showed mineral staining and water damage patterns that were consistent with the markings having been made years earlier, not recently. Dr. Morrison's preliminary report concluded that the scratches represented a genuine attempt by a child to communicate her identity and situation, carved by someone who had been imprisoned in the basement for an unknown period of time. The discovery of Becca's name scratched into the basement wall transformed the investigation from a missing persons case to a homicide investigation. The mill complex was sealed off completely, with round-the-clock security to preserve the integrity of the crime scene, while investigators worked to uncover additional evidence. Detective Santos assembled a task force that included FBI behavioral analysts, forensic specialists from the state police, and experts in cold case investigations who could bring decades of experience to bear on the evidence they were uncovering. The task force began by reconstructing the timeline of the mill complex's use and occupancy since 2010, looking for anyone who might have had access to the basement of Building C during the period when Becca could have been held there. City records showed that the property had been officially abandoned and secured since the mill's closure in 1987, but security had been minimal and the buildings had been accessed regularly by urban explorers, homeless individuals seeking shelter, and teenagers looking for places to party or experiment with drugs and alcohol. More significantly, the investigators discovered that several construction and maintenance projects had been conducted at the mill complex between 2010 and 2012, work that had been authorized by the city as part of efforts to prevent further deterioration of the buildings and to address safety hazards. The projects had included roof repairs, asbestos abatement in selected areas, and structural reinforcement work that was intended to prevent complete collapse of the most damaged buildings. One of the construction projects had involved work in the basement of Building C, specifically the installation of temporary structural supports and the sealing of floor drains that had been allowing water to accumulate and cause additional damage to the building's foundation. The work had been performed by Hayes Construction, a small local company that had been awarded the contract through the city's competitive bidding process. The project had been completed in November 2010, just 3 weeks after Becca's disappearance. Detective Santos immediately began investigating Hayes Construction and its employees, particularly focusing on workers who had been involved in the Building C basement project. The company's owner, Robert Hayes, had died in 2019, but Santos was able to locate employment records and interview several former employees who had worked for the company during the relevant time period. Most of the workers had moved away from Riverside in the years since the mill project was completed, but Santos tracked them down in other Pennsylvania towns and neighboring states, conducting interviews that focused on their memories of the basement work and any unusual circumstances they might have encountered. The breakthrough came when Santos interviewed Marcus Washington, a former Hayes Construction employee who was living in Cleveland and working as a supervisor for a larger construction company. Washington remembered the Building C basement project vividly because of several unusual circumstances that had made the job more complicated and time-consuming than originally anticipated. Most significantly, he recalled that one section of the basement had been sealed off with fresh concrete that appeared to have been poured recently, despite the fact that the mill had been abandoned for more than 20 years. When Washington and his crew had tried to investigate the sealed area to determine whether it might affect their structural work, they had been told by their supervisor, a man named Daniel Hayes, who was Robert Hayes' nephew, that the concrete work had been authorized by the city and that they should focus on their assigned tasks rather than exploring other parts of the basement. Daniel Hayes had been insistent that the sealed area remain undisturbed, and he had been present throughout the duration of the project to ensure that the workers followed his instructions. Marcus Washington's account led Detective Santos to begin investigating Daniel Hayes, a search that revealed a pattern of behavior that should have attracted attention years earlier. Hayes had worked intermittently for his uncle's construction company, but he had also moved frequently throughout western Pennsylvania and eastern Ohio, taking temporary jobs and leaving town abruptly whenever questions were raised about his behavior or his background. In 3 different communities, he had been questioned by police in connection with reports of suspicious activity near schools or playgrounds, but he had never been arrested or charged with any crimes. Most disturbing of all, Santos discovered that Hayes had left Riverside permanently in December 2010, just 1 month after completing the Building C basement project. He had told his uncle that he had found steady work with a construction company in Toledo, Ohio, but when Santos contacted the company, she learned that Hayes had worked there for only 6 weeks before being terminated for failing to show up for work. His trail went cold after that, with no employment records, no forwarding addresses, and no contact with family members who might have known his whereabouts. The search for Daniel Hayes became a multi-state investigation involving law enforcement agencies from Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, and Michigan. His photograph was distributed to police departments and parole offices throughout the region, accompanied by warnings that he should be considered extremely dangerous and might be responsible for multiple child abductions. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit developed a profile of Hayes based on the evidence from Becca's case and the pattern of his movements, concluding that he was likely a serial predator who targeted children in small towns where he could establish temporary employment and blend into the community. The manhunt for Daniel Hayes ended on April 18, 2024, when police in Youngstown, Ohio, arrested him during a traffic stop for driving with expired license plates. He had been living under the assumed name David Harrison and working at a scrap metal yard, but his fingerprints quickly revealed his true identity. When police searched his apartment, they found a collection that confirmed their worst fears. Photographs of children taken without their knowledge, newspaper clippings about missing persons cases from across Pennsylvania and Ohio, and most damning of all, a small wooden box containing children's belongings that served as trophies from his crimes. Inside the wooden box, investigators found items that connected Hayes to at least 4 different child abduction cases, spanning more than a decade. There was a small toy car that had belonged to an 8-year-old boy who had disappeared from a playground in Akron in 2008, a hair clip that matched the description of one worn by a 7-year-old girl who had vanished from a school bus stop in Wheeling in 2009, a bracelet that had belonged to a 9-year-old boy who had disappeared while riding his bicycle in Newcastle in 2011, and at the very bottom of the box, a single yellow ribbon that had never faded despite years of handling. Under interrogation, Daniel Hayes initially claimed that he had found the items in various locations and had kept them simply as curiosities, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. DNA analysis confirmed that the yellow ribbon in his possession matched samples taken from other ribbons that had belonged to Becca Turner, and forensic examination of the other items in the wooden box revealed DNA evidence linking Hayes to the other missing children. Faced with the certainty of multiple life sentences, Hayes finally agreed to cooperate with investigators and provide a complete confession. His account of what had happened to Rebecca Turner was both heartbreaking and horrifying. Hayes confessed that he had been watching Becca for several weeks before her disappearance, learning her daily routines and identifying opportunities when she might be vulnerable. On October 23, 2010, he had parked his truck near the intersection of Franklin and River Street and had approached Becca as she walked home from art club. He had told her that her grandmother had been injured in an accident and that he had been sent to bring her to the hospital, a lie that had convinced a frightened 10-year-old to get into his vehicle willingly. Instead of driving to the hospital, Hayes had taken Becca to the mill complex, where he had been conducting security inspections as part of his construction work and had identified the basement of Building C as a location where he could hide her without risk of discovery. He had prepared the space in advance, bringing food, water, and blankets, and he had installed a hidden ventilation system that would prevent her from suffocating while keeping her cries from being heard by anyone outside the building. Hayes claimed that he had planned to keep Becca alive and had never intended to kill her, but his confession revealed the depth of his psychological pathology and the calculated nature of his crimes. He had kept her imprisoned in the basement for 6 days, visiting daily to bring food and water while he decided what to do with her. During those 6 days, Becca had been extraordinarily brave and resourceful, using a small nail she had found in the basement to scratch her name and a plea for help into the concrete wall, and hiding one of her yellow ribbons in a crack in the wall where she hoped it might eventually be discovered. On the 6th night of her captivity, Hayes confessed, Becca had attempted to escape when he had left the basement door unlocked while bringing her dinner. She had made it as far as the main floor of the building before he caught her, and in his panic and rage at her attempt to flee, he had struck her with a piece of rebar that had been left behind by construction workers. The blow had killed her instantly, Hayes claimed, and he had spent the following 3 days constructing a false wall in the deepest part of the basement, behind which he had concealed her body, along with her backpack and the clothes she had been wearing. The false wall had been Hayes's most diabolical innovation, a carefully constructed barrier that appeared to be part of the building's original structure, but that actually concealed a space large enough to hide a child's body. He had built the wall using materials that were already present in the basement, and he had aged the concrete and mortar to match the surrounding surfaces, making the concealment nearly invisible to casual observation. The wall had been designed to be permanent, intended to ensure that Becca's remains would never be discovered and that he would never be held accountable for his crimes. But Hayes had underestimated the persistence of a 10-year-old girl's determination to be found. Before her death, Becca had managed to work one of her yellow ribbons into a crack in the basement's drainage system, where it had remained hidden for 13.5 years, until changes in the building's water flow had finally carried it to where Lisa Chen would spot it during her photography session. The ribbon had been Becca's final message to the world, a yellow beacon of hope that had survived decay and time and had ultimately led investigators back to the truth. On May 3, 2024, investigators used ground-penetrating radar and specialized equipment to locate and carefully demolish Hayes's false wall. Behind it, they found Becca Turner exactly where he had said she would be, still wearing her blue jacket and purple backpack, still clutching in her small hand the nail she had used to scratch her name into the wall. She had been 10 years old for 13.5 years, preserved in the basement darkness while her community had mourned and searched, and never given up hope that she would someday be found. Becca Turner was finally brought home on a bright spring morning that seemed to celebrate her return with sunshine and warm breezes that carried the scent of blooming flowers. The entire town of Riverside turned out for her funeral, carrying yellow ribbons and sunflowers and memories of a little girl who had never stopped fighting even in her darkest hours. She was buried next to her grandmother Eleanor in Riverside Cemetery, under a headstone that read simply, Becca Turner, beloved granddaughter and friend, who taught us that love is stronger than fear. Daniel Hayes was sentenced to death for Rebecca's murder, with additional life sentences for the killings of the 4 other children whose belongings had been found in his wooden box of trophies. At his sentencing hearing, Margaret Walsh, Eleanor Turner's sister, read a statement on behalf of the Turner family. Becca spent her final days trying to tell us where she was and what had happened to her. It took 13.5 years, but her courage and determination finally brought her home. Her yellow ribbon led us back to her, just as she knew it would. She never gave up, and neither did we, and neither should anyone who has lost a child to violence. The truth has a way of surviving even the darkest places, and love has a way of reaching across any distance, even the distance between life and death. The old Riverside Mill complex was demolished 6 months later, its buildings reduced to rubble, and its land transformed into a memorial park where children could play safely in the shadow of the past. At the center of the park stands a sculpture of a young girl with yellow ribbons in her hair, reaching toward the sky with her arms outstretched as if she were about to take flight. The plaque at the base of the sculpture reads, "In memory of Becca Turner and all the children who have shown us that hope can survive in the darkest places, that courage comes in the smallest packages, and that love is the one force that can never truly be destroyed." Every October 23rd, the anniversary of her disappearance, the people of Riverside gather at the Memorial Park to tie yellow ribbons to the trees and remember the little girl who refused to be forgotten. Children play on the swings and slides, while adults share stories of Becca's kindness and determination, her love of art and music, and the way she had insisted on finding something beautiful in every day, despite living in a town that had lost its way. The yellow ribbons flutter in the autumn breeze like pieces of captured sunlight, reminding everyone who sees them that some stories, no matter how tragic, can still teach us about the enduring power of hope and the unbreakable bonds of human love.